Yesterday, we walked through 3 stages of a school's progress toward maturity. Like I said a couple of times, these things crisscross and overlap, and there are always things to do in each stage, or there are things that you could pick up from the stages that we've identified that need to be done at every stage in the school's life, reminding ourselves about who we are and who we're here for, and thinking about, what's going on around us, especially. That's going to be the focus today. But in the early startup of a school, we're looking for substantive conversations on mission and vision, who we are, who we're here for, how do we want to be known. We're looking at our leadership structure, and especially in parochial schools where things have a tendency to be a little more complicated because you have multi-level leadership within a congregation or within a denomination to which we need to answer, and identifying who's in charge of what, and what do we expect from that, what do we expect from that leadership. We need to think about policies and principles, get stuff written down, with a priority being on the protection, safety of children, connecting and assuring parents that the things that they care about are under consideration, and then also considering how the various things that we have to have in place in order to make good decisions going forward. And then thinking about the finances. Even at the very earliest stages, or even before we exist as an entity, to whatever extent we can, thinking out ahead of ourselves, and not just sort of taking the financial realities on as they appear to us, but trying to put together some sort of a trajectory, some sort of a plan, some set of expectations that for the financial performance of our school, and that involves identifying sources of revenue and thinking through what, practically speaking, are going to be the most consistent and reliable ways to fund our school. And also, on the other side of the ledger, where are we going to end up spending the most money, and how do we structure those investments? And then, as we get into the first 3 or 4 years, we're stepping back, we're reflecting on ourselves and our performance. How consistently, how well are we practicing our principles? The things that we said we want to be about, how are we doing that actually in the day-to-day course? And how does that affect our decision-making about the various questions that arise, having to do with curriculum, or having to do with faculty and staff, having to do with relationships within the community, having to do with the quality of relationship between our school and other ministries of the church that we serve, those types of questions. And then we talked yesterday afternoon about how to structure a planning process that at 10 years or so, now we can start thinking more about the future, because we kind of know what our current reality is. We've become accustomed to our community. We've become accustomed to the way we get things done. We understand the various points of harmony and tension that exist within the community. So how do we start to think about the future? And so in that sort of 10 to 20 year period of a school, a common reality is that whatever we think or whatever we believe about ourselves as a school community and as a functioning institution, the perceptions and the opinions and the public reputation of our school starts to matter more and more and more. So if we've been around for 15 years, we've made an impact in the community. So not only, as I said in that little blurb that I wrote, not only is the impact the absence of our students from other schools, whether they're public or private or whatever, but it's also, we will have established a reputation. We will be known for something or some certain things. My favorite, almost tragic example of this was a school in Dallas at about 15, when it was about 15 years old. No, it wasn't even that. It would have been like 11, 12 years old, something like that. There was a girls' varsity basketball game, and the predominantly white school was playing a predominantly African-American school, which was private but sort of an urban mission school. And they won the game 100-0. With parents cheering on the sidelines, going for that 100, going for the shutout. Well, ESPN heard about it. And to this day, if you Google that school, guess what comes up? 100-0. A bunch of rich white girls beat up on a bunch of poor black girls and beat them 100-0. So they fired the coach, but kind of too late. And the reputation of that school nationally, not just in Dallas where it exists, nationally will be defined by that until it falls off the front page of Google in the year 3000. Yeah. Whatever that will be. I have no idea. So that's like the worst case scenario example. Or you've got a scandal in which children are harmed, or something terrible happens like that in your school. But conversely, we also develop reputations for positive things as well, because people come to our school and they have great experiences, and our students do well, and so I just want to talk today a little bit about what that means and why the market matters, even to schools that are skeptical perhaps of the validity of what external forces mean about or what external opinions mean about our schools. So I'll start with this. How we know we've made a market difference. We will have people in our school who have asked, so do you love the fact that your school is a classical school? And they will say, sure. They might even say, well, that's not why I'm here, but it's fine. I think my kids are learning a lot, but they're not necessarily bought in. It's like we said yesterday afternoon. It's like in the early stages of our school, everybody's bought in because we need this consensus of opinion, or this consensus of motivation to get a classical and Lutheran school started in the first place. And if we have 4 or 5 founders all with different ideas about what kind of a school this is, one person thinks it should be Montessori, and another person thinks this should be classical, and another person thinks, well, what we really need is a baseball Lutheran school. It doesn't get started. It doesn't get started. But once we've got 100 families or so, we start to find people in our midst who are drawn not so much because of the mission that motivated the founding, but because it's just a good school. And I go to church with these friends of mine, and their kids are having a great experience there, and I trust them, and so we're giving it a shot. We're giving it a shot. And if you're 10 or 11 years in, this can be disorienting, right? Because you look around, it's like, where did these people come from? Why do they not love classical Christian education? Why do they not salivate over the opportunity for their children to learn Latin in the 3rd grade? So, and then they're going to be sort of Lutheran, We don't mind Lutheranism. You know, it's cool. You know, I mean, we go to Gateway. We go to the, you know, the big dark church with the lights, but you know, our kids can go to, you know, a Lutheran school, and you know, it's simple. It's, you know, it's quaint. It's nice. You know, people are friendly. They love Jesus. And then you've got people who are like, oh yeah, so we used to be at that other school, and now we're here. Which, it's like, well, we're not anything like that other school. And it's like, how did you make that choice in the first place? You know? But they're here now. And for a variety of reasons. And they will say, once they're here, we love St. Paul Lutheran School, until they leave for some other shiny thing, or because there was a problem that really got under their skin that they couldn't get fixed satisfactorily, or, you know, Dad wants to buy a boat, and that's how much the tuition is taking up. So, I mean this, of course, a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's sort of, we know we're successful when we've got people in our school who don't really care about the school's identity. But that's going to be the reality. That's probably, in some senses, the reality for some of you. And what that translates into is that there is an external perception about your school and its quality and the experience that children and families are having in your school, which is driving the attractiveness of your school more than the things that we care about inside of our schools. And this requires a significant adjustment in perspective, a significant adjustment in our relationships with our families, and our understanding of what's going on outside of our school. We have two tempting poles that we can be stretched between. So there's a defensive posture, which I will call, against what we'll call market-driven delusion. And honestly, I haven't seen this happen in very many classical schools. I can't think of one classical school, actually, where this has happened, where that there are so many people who come into the school who you know, don't care very much about that classical or that Christian identity, that somehow the school just sort of abdicates and says, well, this is our new constituency, so we're going to do whatever the new constituency says that they want to do. I think that there are, in mature schools, like we said yesterday, you know, there's more tension that exists. It becomes a more complicated thing to determine what are mission essentials in our schools. But this is sort of one pole, where the market just comes in and says, classical, schmassical, what we want is robotics. So let's be a STEM school. Let's just go compete with the charter schools straight up, and schools just do it. Like I said, haven't seen it very often, or at all really, but it's there. The other, though, can be equally corruptive, which is sort of this nostalgia-driven inertia, where we pine for the days in which everybody agreed about everything. Whether that was true or not, but we can imagine, you know, we can create an alternate history where 15 years ago we didn't have to argue with people about stuff. Everybody just kind of agreed, and we just went on about our business. And or you know, like I was saying yesterday, we get so connected to the features of our school that we're somewhat motivated by our mission, somewhat motivated by our purpose, that we begin to equate the features with the mission itself. Like my example about the desks yesterday. We don't want to be in either of these positions as a school. We don't want to be driven by the market to do things that are counter to our values, but we also don't want to get ourselves stuck in this notion that a 15-year-old school can somehow function and feel just like a 5-year-old school, because that would equate to a lack of progress. So somewhere in the middle there, schools have to figure out, have to find their way inside the marketplace. So this mission question, for whom are we here? And I've sort of invented a logical trip that can occur here. So size and maturity, we like to grow, we hope to become more mature, also often results in cost, additional cost, and what I'm calling periodic inefficiency. So if I've got a school, let's say of 150 kids, and I can see that rates of growth are going to take us maybe to 250 kids over the next 3 or 4 years or something like that, then I have to start thinking about, what am I going to have here? Who am I going to have here in order to serve a population of 250 kids or say 100 families that doesn't presently exist? And if I am thinking ahead, and if I got a reliable planning structure in place, I'm starting to think, well, I might need an assistant principal. Well, do I wait until we've needed an assistant principal for 2 years? And everything started to get raggedy before I hire that person? Or do we hire that person now, get out ahead, get the systems and processes in place that are going to be adequate for 250 kids, understanding that that person might not even have a full-time, enough work to do, day to day that would constitute full-time. So it's inefficient, but it can be prudent, right? We're getting ahead of a growth curve rather than lagging behind. So things like that will happen. More cost means I'm going to need more tuition revenue. Now, I might need more revenue from donors or more revenue from the congregation too, but for most of our schools, the vast bulk of our revenue is going to be tied to tuition. And so as the cost increases, even as the cost increases because of temporary inefficiencies, then we're going to end up with more tuition revenue necessary, which means it goes up. Right? So now instead of $8,000 a year, we're saying it's $9,200 a year, or whatever that translates to in your school. Higher tuition is going to translate into, in some people's minds, some perception of exclusion. Some people are going to start to feel priced out. Some people are going to start to feel like this friendly, parochial, inviting, inclusionary school is going in the wrong direction. People outside of our community will not necessarily feel that way, but people inside of our community might start to feel that way. So if a family, we talked about affordability on day one, if a family has felt like a $6,000 tuition was manageable even for their 3 kids, and now suddenly this is a $9,000 school, we just added a whole nother tuition and a half to that family's bill, and that can hurt. That can hurt. And it can translate, even if they can afford that or they can figure a way to manage that, it can translate into those feelings of resentment against the school and where it's headed, because exclusion is not a Lutheran consumer value. We're all about inclusion. That's what we do. We're all about the gospel. We're about grace. We're about, don't worry about who you are or where you are. You belong. And so it gets hard when people start to feel like the school is in some way exclusionary. So we have to figure out, how do we remain not affordable, right? Because we don't use that word anymore. We've excised that word from our vocabulary. How do we remain accessible? So here's a formula. Little thing to stick in your pocket and take home. If your school costs, by the way, I only do math with numbers that end in 0. So this is very artificial, very contrived, but the pattern holds. So if your school costs $600,000 to operate and we're charging $10,000 per student, we can have 6 grades with 10 students each, and we end up with a balanced budget. We're not profitable, but we're black, okay? And someone walks into the church council meeting or the school board meeting and says, you know what, if we charge $7,500, I'll bet we could attract more kids to our school. And so everyone votes and says, yes, let's be a $7,500 school. And it works. We get 12 more kids. And we also get a deficit of $60,000. Not huge, only 10%. But where's that money coming from? However, if someone thinks of it in that first conversation and says, yes, a 72-student school would be better than a 60-student school, but let's try to go at it a different way. Let's raise tuition from $10,000 to $11,000, because people who can afford $10,000, it's not $11,000 isn't going to make a substantial difference, probably. And let's take 9% of our budget and put it into tuition assistance fund, financial aid fund. We can then recruit the same 12 students for $2,500 less in tuition than they would have paid at $7,500 if they qualify. Right? I mean, we don't just give away discounts to people who don't need them. But if they qualify, we can use that additional revenue to provide for tuition assistance, and we're back to black, back to even. By the way, this is how Concordia prices, right? So I don't know what the sticker price is on Concordia Chicago's education, but it's probably $25,000 a year, more, 30, whatever. Some people pay $30,000 to come to school here, but those people who are paying $30,000 to come to school here are subsidizing the people who can come to school here for $10,000. So we call this a collegiate pricing model. Colleges have been doing this for decades, right? Now, of course, there are other there are endowments and other things, but no one here has an endowment for their school, right? No, of course not. 90% of private schools don't have an endowment or don't have an endowment that's sufficient to make a difference. Yeah.
I apologize if you've already covered this, but I've heard people discuss we will raise 30% of our total funding costs from tuition, up to 75% of our total operating costs are going to come from tuition.
Yeah.
Do you see an optimal number in schools that are thriving in terms of percentages amongst income streams?
Yeah, 107%.
Really?
If you want a school that is really going to thrive, then you need to be bringing in 100% plus of your operating expenses from tuition.
I've never heard anyone say that.
I know. Profitability equals thriving. So let me describe the way that we organize our schools financially from a different perspective, all right? So I went into business for myself in 2006. Help me evaluate whether this would sound like a plausible business plan. So my goal would be to generate 80% of the income that I need in order to maintain my present lifestyle. And then On the weekends, I'm going to go with a bucket and stand at an intersection and try to collect the other 20%. If I presented that to you as a business plan, or if I presented that to my wife as a business plan, she'd be like, let's just not do this, right? But if I'm a school and I've designed my revenue, my operating revenue, to cover 80% or even 90% of my operating cost, I'm essentially doing the same thing, because I'm going to have to take a bucket somewhere to someone and say, help me plug the gap that I've created for myself because I planned a deficit.
Because we're self-conscious about charging too much.
Yes. We're self-conscious or we're afraid that people just aren't going to buy it. Yeah. Either way, it's a self-centered concern. Or even more philanthropically, we're worried about not being able to include more people. And that's why we keep getting stuck in that affordability loop. It's like, but the recurring question is, affordable for whom? Yeah. When we use that phrase, especially sort of at a governance level, what we're talking about, what we basically mean is affordable for people like me. My friends whose lifestyles are very much like mine, and that becomes our target audience. But it's a moving target. You can't get there. So you have to think about, how do we provide accessibility? So in this model, this simple model, the goal here is 100%. We're not raising any money outside of tuition. So, but we still don't have any margin. I mean, but we've got 12 more kids in the school at half the cost. So we're way, way, way more accessible than we were with 60 kids, everybody paying full cost. That's how we present ourselves to a community that is worried about exclusion. We say, yes, it costs what it costs. Laws of gravity, right? The pencil still falls. It doesn't float in the air just because we're a Christian school or a Lutheran school. But we can use basic economics in order to be more inclusive, in order to remain accessible to more people. And this is simple, like 12 kids at 5,000, but it's an average of 5,000. So 2 of those kids might come for 1,000. And 2 of those kids might come for, 8,000. But however it gets constructed, we're still remaining accessible. Or we have suddenly become more accessible than we were before, and we're meeting our obligations. We're not putting ourselves in deficits. We're not underpaying our teachers. We're not cutting corners. We're operating our school the way the school needs to be operated in a sustainable way. Yes?
Quick question.
So this is counterintuitive, am I right?
Yeah.
You raise tuition in order to become more socioeconomically diverse. Right. Everybody's like, what? Yeah.
Does it ever make any sense to sort of grandfather people in that have been coming?
At a certain level, if you're going to raise tuition, only if they qualify for tuition assistance, And I always recommend, if you're going to have financial aid, have a third party like FACTS or somebody else manage that for you, so it's confidential, and they are going to do it better than you can ever do it with your invented formulas and your spreadsheets, right? So it does make sense if, let me put it this way. So I've worked with schools who have done this, all right? So they needed to raise tuition, let's say 20%. And they're going to stair step it over 3 years or so. And what they've done is they have basically created 2 levels of tuition. So new families come in at the higher level, and then the families that remain are being stair-stepped up. But I have one of the schools that I've done this with, they ended up taking so long to stair-step up that by the time, I mean, it was 7 years in and they still hadn't gotten up because they were afraid. They were afraid to look their people, their people in the eye and say, we've been undercharging you. And here's what undercharging you means to the operation of our school. So I don't recommend that anymore, just because I've had a couple of bad experiences with it. It's like, let's just do it, and let's make a case for it. We've been charging you $7,500 for a $10,000 education because that's what it really costs, and we've been scrounging around in order to fill that gap of $2,500 per kid, and we can't do that anymore. Because what it usually translates into is that the families in the school with more means end up disproportionately bearing the burden of that cost for everybody else, because they'll give to the annual fund, right? Or they'll buy expensive stuff at the auction or whatever it is, but they're carrying the water for everybody else who's essentially getting tuition assistance and they don't even know it. Oh, and by the way, right, like we said yesterday, one of the ways we end up being able to operate at $7,500 is we're underpaying people or we're overworking people. So the employees themselves are actually providing financial aid to all the families who are enjoying this underpriced education. So I know that's a lot, but if you've got a sensible approach to remaining accessible as you meet the demands of growth and cost, because they are inevitable, laws of physics, then you can be in a more comfortable position, and you're having sensible, mathematically sound conversations with your people about how this all works, rather than just like picking numbers out of the air and saying, well, hope it works this year. Any other thoughts on that? Does anybody do anything like this in your schools now in order to provide financial aid or access?
We just do the incessant dinner auctions.
Yeah, the dinner auctions. And that goes to some form of financial aid, right? Typically, right. So, and that's what a lot of schools decide to do. They decide, well, we're going to raise that money. And there are people who will, but the problem is we've already spent the money. When all those families sign the contracts for $7,500 or for $5,000 at a discount because they qualify for financial aid back in March, we just spent all that money. And we're hoping that in October or in April, enough people will buy enough junk from our auction that will be able to cover that cost. But what if it doesn't? We just pass it on to the next year, And by the way, this is not the topic. I didn't mean for this to become like a financial planning seminar for your school. However, I will say this. When we end up with a cash shortfall at the end of a fiscal year, let's say in May or June, how do we cover that typically? If we can't raise the money, if we can't raise it into what? Prepaid tuition. So I have worked with schools who have made that sort of their fiscal habit of using next year's money to cover this year's gap because they're not charging enough or they're not raising enough. Their business model isn't working on an annual basis. But I've worked with schools who over years have accumulated as much as a sixth to an eighth to a sixth of their operating budget in a debt to themselves. And what happens is that you start running out of money earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier, forcing you into borrowing more and more and more from next year and it becomes a vicious, that it will shut your school down. Or it will make your congregation so crazy, so nuts, that they will shut your school down. Because they won't understand that. You won't be able to explain that to, the people in your congregation that, basically the explanation is, well, we've undercharged and we've had to borrow every year from future tuition, and so we now owe ourselves X percentage of this year's operating budget, which means we progressively or regressively end up owing more and more to ourselves as it goes along. It's a terrible, terrible trap to get into. I have a friend, I just saw him on over the weekend over at Calvin College, and he went to a school in North Carolina, big school. Steph Curry went to school there, if you know who Steph Curry is. So, big school, very, fancy. Nice, fancy Christian school. And he got there and he discovered that the school had been doing this for about a decade, and they owed themselves $3.5 million on about a $10 or $12 million budget. It took him 12 years to pay that back, to get everything back. So all the things that he wanted to do when he first came to the school, everything got put on hold because they were paying themselves back $500,000 a year for the mistakes that had been made. So it's a different scale, and it sounds really astonishing when it's $3.5 million. But if your budget is $500,000 and you owe yourself $50,000, how long is it going to take you to pay that back? All right? And that's two part-time salaries. So just cautionary tale. Yeah.
Question, I don't know. So I had worked under a pastor one time who had insisted that all our staff, like our secretary, our janitor and everything, when we hired them would be non-members, because then it would be easier to deal with them should we need to let them go.
Okay.
Be all the emotional stuff done. So then I'm wondering if in this realm, if it would be wise for schools to bring someone on who's a non-member to help us do this, because then they wouldn't be scared of urging us to raise the cost because we're still scared of it for our own members.
Yeah.
Because that then increases our cost.
I don't think that's the best solution. The best solution is let's all agree on what a plausible business model for a school looks like, and let's discipline ourselves to operating within policies that make that happen. And if those policies lead us into awkward situations, well, they will. But, the school business is an awkward business anyway. We're at this weird confluence, right? This intersection of parents' love for their kids, parents' egos invested in their kids growing up, kids making mistakes, parents resenting the fact that someone else recognized that their children have made mistakes. If we're not used to awkwardness, just in the daily life of our school, but when it comes to money, we do have sort of this double shield that exists. But we've got to be just more practical and more transparent about it. In most schools, in most churches, a school is the only revenue-generating ministry. Everything else is dependent on donations from the congregation in order to operate. Well, let's take advantage of that. Let's make that work, both for the ministry of the school, but the ministry of the whole congregation. In the work that we do with parochial schools, the things get rough between the school and other ministries and the school and the congregation when the school is financially dependent on the church. If the school is financially self-sustaining, then all those little complaints about, nicked walls and in occupied Bible study rooms and all of that stuff has a tendency not to be taken as seriously. But if we're dependent on the congregation because our business model doesn't make any sense, then all of that stuff seems to matter more. That's just the nature of what I've observed. So, how would you define complacency?
Give a darn is busted.
What?
The give a darn is busted.
Okay, I don't like that. It's a good Minnesota definition.
You betcha.
How would you define complacency?
It is what it is, and I don't want to put the effort into it.
Okay, it is what it is. Good or bad, it is what it is.
We've already done it this way,
Uh-huh.
and it's going.
Yeah. It's okay. It's working all right. Anybody else? When do you think a school is most likely to become complacent? In what circumstances? Where things are going well or things are going badly?
There's nothing at risk.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I always thought that too. But what I find is that the most complacent schools that I encounter are schools in which things are not going very well. It's kind of weird. And it's not always because they don't understand that things aren't going well. Something, the give a darn somehow has evaporated somehow. So here are a couple of things just to keep in mind. Because complacency in success and complacency in failure, to me, they are equally damaging. Equally damaging. So I just thought of like 6 things to keep in mind about complacency. Faculty tenure is not a measure of quality classroom culture. Just because someone's been with us for 15 years doesn't mean they're doing a good job in the ways in which we need the job to be done. Catechesis is not a sufficient measure of discipleship. It's necessary. It's hard to disciple someone who doesn't know anything about the Bible or theology, but it's not a sufficient measurement. And it's one of those things where we've learned the shorter catechism, it's in the curriculum, we've done it, and we could still not have meaningful relationships with our students and our families that are drawing them toward Jesus. Workload is not a quantifiable measure of a classical ethos, which is a fancy way of saying just because kids have a lot of work to do doesn't mean they're being well educated. I was trying to fit all these into the same syntactical formula, so they're not all perfect. Size is not a reliable measure of quality, large or small. Just because I have 1,000 kids in my school doesn't necessarily mean I'm a good school. Just because I've got exactly the 150 students that I want in my school also does not necessarily mean that I'm a good school. Balanced budget is not a reliable measure of quality and sustainability. I'll give you an example of this. Recently, I was working on a school's budget. I was trying to figure out just sort of the contours of it, and there was something missing. And I couldn't figure out exactly what it was because it's a balanced budget. It's a budget that is about $8.5 million, and it's plus or minus about $100,000 in any given year, which, you know, is essentially balanced, right, for a budget that size. But but the school has a cash flow problem. They start to run thin on cash in June and July. So I'm trying to figure out, you know, where this is, and I just happened to ask, it's like, where are the faculty discounts? And she was like, well, they're in the budget. I was like, well, I can't find them. There's not a line on it. I've got tuition assistance and I've got like other multi-child discounts and that sort of thing, but I couldn't find the faculty discounts. And she goes, okay, well, let me ask the bookkeeper. And the bookkeeper has a spreadsheet. And on that spreadsheet, there is $1.1 million in faculty and staff discounts that isn't on the profit and loss statement, the annual budget. They have a balanced budget, except they don't. 1/8 of their revenue is tucked away on a spreadsheet someplace because all that's being reported is the net tuition that the faculty and staff are paying. So it shows up in the revenue side, but it isn't showing up in the expense side. So we've got a little problem to fix at this school over the next year or two, right? So balanced budget reported is not necessarily equate to a thriving institution. So mission and vision. Back to here. This is where we start, this is where we end. Who are we? For whom are we? It was fun last evening. We were sitting around talking about some of the dynamics of who attends some of our schools, and somebody was saying that they have Sikhs and Muslims, and forget who else. Do you remember who else Steve said? Yeah, Buddhists. Yeah, Sikhs, Muslims, Buddhists, I think, in their school, sending their kids to a Lutheran school, Lutheran classical school. Now, maybe every Lutheran classical school won't do that, but I just find that so exhilarating that Muslim kids are being taught to love Jesus with all their hearts and their souls and their minds, heart, strength, and minds, even if their families don't believe in Jesus. What will we accomplish? What's the impact on children? The impact on their experience? How will they describe us, their experience with us? What's the impact on their future? And how and when will we accomplish these things? By what means? Thank you.